Because this economic tsunami that has broken in the US, it's not universally understood, but at the summits of US society, they speak frankly that the US, and parts of the US at least, are mired in recession at the present time. After all, Warren Buffett, we're told this week, the richest man in the world, who lives a very humble lifestyle, it seems, but nevertheless has piled up a colossal amount of wealth. He says, without qualification, the US is in recession. And the rate of growth on average has gone from about 4% to just over 0. Alan Greenspan, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, says that the US is in 0 growth at the present time. 1/5 of the states, the individual states of the US, are already in recession. Streets now, not individual properties, but streets and regions in cities of the US are already idle at the present time. And the effects of this, by the way, I was amused seeing the economic effects of the earthquake, the little mini earthquake that developed in Britain only a matter of a week ago, and the big cost that this would represent. Already, this Katrina, this economic Katrina, which is, by the way, was devastating in its effects, this economic Katrina has dwarfed the consequence of what was a natural disaster in Britain, because just in the write-downs of the banks alone, arising from the subprime crisis, there's already a loss of $175 billion. And that's just the start, as I will explain in a moment. This, of course, is a consequence of the latest, in this century in particular, the financial credit-driven phase of world capitalism, where mortgages were handed out to the very poorest sections of society. Not on 100%, but in some cases on 150% mortgages, without any possibility of those poor people ever being able to repay their mortgages. By the way, in Scotland, where I was a week ago, one comrade in Dundee commented he was forced to buy a house. He's paid off £40,000 and he hasn't paid off a penny of his capital. And in effect is in the trap that many people in the US already experience at the present time. This debt, as we know, through what is being called securitization, was parcelled up, was distributed throughout the world, and what I would say is a giant pasta parcel. Except there's a little bit of a difference. In this pasta parcel, there's not a chocolate bar, but a goodie at the end. There's a financial bomb which is blown up in the face of world capitalism. It resulted in the credit crunch, which simply put means that the arteries of world capitalism are seizing up. With all the bad debts of the banks now, how can they possibly take the risk, with all the consequences that flow from that, of lending from new borrowers? So the system is seizing up. It's jamming, in the words of Karl Marx in Capital, at this particular moment in time. And it's not the end of the matter, because in the subprime crisis alone, there's an estimated additional $225 billion. The problem is, this financial mafia don't know where the bodies are buried. They don't know where that debt is. They don't know the consequences of that debt. And that points up a very important point that Marxism has driven home about the blind character of world capitalism, where the society works, the development of capitalism is worked out behind the backs of society. There's no conscious control. There's no conscious intervention of society in the development of colossal financial developments. And then there's the brewing financial crises in cars rental, in commercial properties, in monolines, which we've all given the detail. Monolines is insurance for the enormous debt that has been built up. I'm not going to give the figures here. They've been carried in the excellent material in Socialism Today and in the pages of the newspaper, The Socialist itself. But what is pointed up by this, and not just in the financial sector, is what we have developing in world capitalism today is not just one crisis, but a series of crises. What we have is a chain of crises, and not just in the financial sector, but spreading into the real economy. It's not an accident that the very terminology that we have used to describe this development of a spiral process, and actually in the development of capitalism, in the boom phase, there's a spiral process in which one factor impacts on another to the development of world capitalism. Consequently, or conversely, there is also in the downswing of capitalism a spiral process in which there's a reinforcement of these developments as they're taking place. And what is so striking, which I want to underline here today, to bring out the seriousness of the situation, is that there's no debate in the ranks of the ruling class. There might be debates from some oddballs who turn up at our public meetings and say, well, the Socialist Party's got it slightly wrong on the question of perspectives of the world economy, because capitalism has got huge reserves and can extricate itself from this situation. Of course, Marxism never says there's a final crisis of capitalism until the working class takes the power from the ruling class. But if you examine the debate taking place in the ranks of the bourgeois internationally, there is no debate that a crisis is coming. All wings of the bourgeois agree that this is development and is already a fact, as I pointed out in the US at the present time. What's under debate is the scale, the depth, and the length of the crisis. And if anything, we're on the conservative, measured wing of commentators at this particular stage. If you examine some of the commentaries, even from a popular point of view, this is the Larry Elliott, queue up for the soup kitchens which start here. I'm famous or infamous for singing a song from the 1930s, Buddy, can you spare a dime? I'm going to be in great demand, believe it or not, on the basis of the trends, and not just for speaking in meetings like this, but for my melodic rendition of this particular song. We have people like Martin Jacks, former renegade from communism, writing in The Guardian, who says, quite simply, this is the big one. We don't go that far. We're very measured in the way that we put it forward. And the former idols of the bourgeois, like Greenspan, now he's not the genius responsible for the boom. He's a serial blower of bubbles that is responsible for this situation at the present time. The bourgeois even has a provisional wing, if I could describe it at that. There's an economist called Nouriel Roubini, and he writes very bluntly the following. I present the nightmare or catastrophic scenario that the Fed and the financial officials around the world are now worried about. Such a scenario has a rising and significant probability of occurring. And he says that house prices in the US could drop anything between 20 to 30%. This could result in a total cumulative effect between $1 trillion and $2 trillion being taken out of purchasing power in the US. And remember, the gross domestic product of the US economy is $12 trillion. It could add to be between 12 and 19% of the GDP of the US, with a loss of 8 million households in negative equity and a minimum of 2 to 3 million people losing their houses in the US, joining the 1 million that have already lost their houses at the present time. And what's the reaction of other sections of the bourgeois? Martin Wolf in the Financial Times says, just a second, this is a bit extreme. This is going a bit too far. I don't think it's likely we're going to have a Great Depression. Maybe a small depression is the most likely outcome. And that's the optimistic wing of bourgeois commentators at this particular moment in time.